The colony of St. Domingue, of which I was commander, enjoyed the greatest tranquillity. Agriculture and commerce flourished there. The island had attained a degree of splendor which it had never before seen, and all this, I dare to say it, was my work. Nevertheless, as we were upon a war footing, the Commission had published a decree ordering me to take all necessary measures to prevent the enemies of the Republic from penetrating into the island. This order was in force when, on the 26th of January, 1802, a squadron appeared before the Cape. I met my aide-de-camp Coupe and an officer sent by General Henry Christophe, who brought me a letter from the general, by which he informed me of the arrival of the French squadron before the Cape. "Surrender the town," he continued. "You will be well recompensed. The French government sends you presents." To which General Christophe replied, "Since you have no letters for the General-in-Chief, nor for me, you may return and tell your general that he does not know his duty, that it is not thus that people present themselves in a country belonging to France." These were some of the opening sentences to the autobiographical memoir of General Toussaint Louverture. By the late 18th century, the colony of St. Domingue was the jewel of France's overseas empire, its vast sugar and coffee plantations generating immense wealth for the mainland, more, in some cases, than their outposts in India. But this prosperity rested on the backs of nearly 500,000 African slaves who were worked, often to their deaths, under grueling conditions. One of St. Domingue's primary exports, sugar, had to be chopped from thick canes via machete, which would often result in fatal injury at the hands of the sharp blade. The processing of sugar was far more deadly and created a superhot molten vat of liquid sugar, which could cause irreversible third-degree burns. The African slaves who were forced to perform these deadly and labor-intensive jobs far outnumbered the colony's white settlers and its free black and mixed-race population, the Affranchis. Though some Affranchis had amassed wealth and status, they were still subjected to an intense discrimination by the colonial elite, creating essentially a group of extremely wealthy and well-connected, second-class, often black citizens who saw themselves as the true stewards of society on the island, and yet simultaneously oppressed by their white French overlords. As we've seen in some of my videos regarding revolutions in South America and in Mexico, creating a powerful class of wealthy men who hate you isn't exactly the greatest idea when trying to keep control of a colonial empire. The broader ideological climate of the Atlantic world also primed St. Domingue for upheaval. The American and French revolutions had introduced the, at that point, radical concepts of liberty and equality of man, while turmoil in France proper made it impossible to focus resources from the French mainland on suppressing the Haitian Revolution. Only 2 months before the revolt in Haiti, the French king and his family attempted to flee Paris to the fortress at Montmédy and launch a counter-revolution with support from his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. This action caused the National Assembly, the body which had effectively controlled France since the revolution began, to forbid incitement to riot, attempting to curb the often violent influence of the Republican parties of the Jacobins and Cordeliers. This action would quickly backfire, plunging the French mainland into chaos. And during this period of revolution and instability, slave resistance had been a constant presence in St. Domingue, through things like the Maroon communities, or communal settlements of freed slaves. These maroon communities often launched sabotages of slave ships and transports, and held occasional slave uprisings. But with the political situation in France threatening the established order, these elements of resistance managed to coalesce into a full-scale rebellion in August of 1791, sparked in part actually by voodoo ceremonies, which the whites often stayed away from out of superstition, which provided a safe environment to plan rebellions between slaves. The revolution occurred in phases, beginning with an initial uprising of enslaved people that swept across the colony's northern plains. Plantation houses were torched, overseers and masters were killed, and the rest of the island was thrown into a panic. In the years that followed, war between former slaves, reinforced by free black and mixed-race militias, would fight the French colonists, who themselves were reinforced by their own allied militias, as well as European armies from Spain and Britain. One of the most formidable figures to emerge from this turmoil was the aforementioned Toussaint Louverture, a former slave who proved to be a brilliant military strategist and statesman. Initially fighting for the Spanish, he later allied with France after the revolutionary government abolished slavery in 1794 in the midst of the Reign of Terror. By 1801, Louverture had consolidated power, abolished slavery across the entire island, and declared himself Governor-General for life. Now in France proper, the Reign of Terror caused an intense hatred of republicanism among the populace. From their perspective, republican so-called virtues had produced nothing but executions, the abolition of Christianity, and mass starvation and exploitation. It was in this environment that the Directory took control, an executive committee that promised to establish a truly benevolent republic in France. However, the Directory was soon uprooted by Napoleon Bonaparte, only 5 years later, who had been leading France to victory after victory in Italy, Austria, Switzerland, Egypt, and other fronts which had opened during the last 10 years of unrest. Bonaparte was unamused by the incompetence of the different governments which had been established and then overthrown in France during this period, and thus declared himself first consul, effectively dictator in the Roman sense, during the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire. First consul Napoleon Bonaparte dispatched an expeditionary force led by his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc in 1801 to reclaim Haiti. Though the French initially gained ground, their campaign was doomed by fierce resistance and an outbreak among the French of yellow fever. But in their failures, they still dealt a major blow to Haiti, as General Toussaint Louverture was captured and sent to France, where he died in captivity. His successors, Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, carried the struggle to its final phase, with Napoleon having declared himself first consul and France drifting ever closer to the First Empire. By 1803, after decisive victory at the Battle of Vertières, the French withdrew to fight more pressing wars in Europe. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declared Haiti's independence, severing the last ties to colonial rule. 11 months later, Napoleon Bonaparte would crown himself Emperor of the French. Haiti's triumph shattered the myth of black inferiority that had underpinned slavery, proving that enslaved people could not only resist but defeat the might of European empires. Yet, rather than inspiring widespread insurrection elsewhere, as some in Haiti assumed would occur, Haiti found itself almost completely isolated. European powers did not want this revolution to become contagious, and thus imposed economic and diplomatic sanctions on Haiti. France, of course, refused to recognize Haitian independence until 1825, and consistently demanded what was effectively a colonial tribute during the Napoleonic period and even thereafter. The United States thus became Haiti's only trade partner, and even then, they could not do so out in the open for fear of British attack. American merchants had to fly pirate flags or operate in total secrecy in order to prevent the Europeans from realizing that America was breaking their sanctions and trading with Haiti, which might have been cause for war between the United States and Britain, or even the American ally of France. Furthermore, politicians, and many merchants for that matter, within the United States greatly feared the precedent set by Haiti's victory. Though the Haitian Revolution did not trigger immediate revolts in the United States and Spanish America, its influence actually did later trickle into South America and the American South after some time, partially due to reports of a free black nation in the West Indies, which made its way from merchants to slave owners and then to enslaved communities by way of word of mouth. These rumors would eventually take the form of an actual figure from this black nation. In 1811, Charles Dessolons, a former enslaved man from St. Domingue, led the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana, the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. Inspired by Haiti, the rebels sought to establish an independent black republic of Louisiana along the Mississippi River. However, they were swiftly and brutally suppressed, their leaders executed and their heads displayed as warnings. Similar anxieties gripped British Jamaica, where British authorities took extraordinary measures to prevent the spread of Haitian radicalism. They cracked down on suspected rebels, restricted communication with Haiti, and deployed overwhelming military force against even minor uprisings. Why, then, did the Haitian Revolution not spread more broadly? The biggest reason was that Haiti was simply unique. There were few other polities in this era wherein the enslaved population demographically outnumbered the colonists to the degree that it had in Haiti. This is apparent when we examine the social environments of places like America, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, or even the Bahamas during this period. Another factor was Haiti's unique geography. Hispaniola is an incredibly mountainous island and allowed for highly effective guerrilla warfare, which simply wasn't possible in places like the American South, which were hilly, but certainly not mountainous, with the exception of regions like Appalachia, which never really saw large black slave populations, simply because land wasn't as suitable for large-scale agriculture. The most important factor going for Haiti, however, was the instability in France, something the British and Americans in particular didn't have to contend with, allowing their militaries and slave-owning populations to respond to any revolutionary sentiment swiftly and without distraction. But the Haitian Revolution did contribute a great shove to the already powerful abolition movements in many European and American countries. For example, across the Atlantic in the following years, the British Empire took the first meaningful steps towards codifying abolition into law. In 1807, the British Empire passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which made it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved people from Africa. And in the following decades, the Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron, an anti-slavery flotilla of some of the British Navy's most experienced captains and ships, dedicated to intercepting, seizing slave ships, and freeing slaves that they found on board. Britain would later pass the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which gradually freed enslaved people throughout the entire empire, and also created a compensation scheme that paid slave owners for their losses. Yet while Britain took a leading role in suppressing the transatlantic slave trade, the plantation economies of the Americas clung to slavery with unrelenting tenacity. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Caribbean. Spanish Cuba expanded its sugar economy well into the 19th century, while Brazil, independent from Portugal in 1822, remained the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to officially abolish slavery all the way into 1888. Even Mexico, which abolished slavery in 1829, struggled to enforce its laws in the face of resistance from Tejanos, where the institution remained entrenched. In the United States, slavery became the defining issue of the nation's great unraveling. The violent struggle over whether newly admitted states would be free or slaveholding erupted in the Bleeding Kansas massacres, where pro- and anti-slavery factions clashed in open warfare. Of course, then the Civil War broke out, which led to President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, but it would take 2 more years of war, hundreds of thousands of lives, and the Union Army's march across the South to fully destroy the institution. Even after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, slavery lingered in practice. It was not until June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, that the last remaining enslaved people in the United States were officially declared free. The abolition of slavery thus did not come as an inevitable tide of moral progress, as some in the United States or Britain had hoped, but as a war waged on plantations, in the halls of government, on the decks of British warships, and across the bloodied battlefields of the Americas and the Caribbean over the course of more than 50 years following the Haitian Revolution. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Haitian Revolution spread to the American South? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Star Galaxy, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alfonso Maurice, Sebastian, The Atomical Mon Studios, PJ the Homeless Mage, Joseph, Chance Bowman, Justin Ambrew, and Dark X. Thank you, and enjoy the video. When reports of the Haitian Revolution came in and spread throughout the southern United States, the reaction was a lot like that of the Austrians or British upon reading the events of the French Revolution. It was a reaction of utter horror and immediate alarm. American slave owners, which, we might note, did not comprise the entirety of whites in the South, feared a copy and paste of this Haitian Revolution, but on a broader scale in America. They believed the Haitian Revolution would usher in a wave of insurrections in America, resulting in massacres of whites, the rise of a black state, or even an independent republic in the American South, all supported by a conspiracy of Northern or even British abolitionists who were funding and arming the rebels due to their hatred of the South. Already, abolitionist materials like David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1929, which was propagated by way of the postal system, was seen as incitement of rebellion. Slave owners also increasingly believed that the Constitution could not save them from abolition, and furthermore that the safety valve of Texas would not work. Southern elites believed that Texas could be used as a means to relocate should something occur in the United States, either rebellion or just abolition, where enslaved plantations could move into the Texas Republic and seek refuge from American abolitionism. As Professor Frederick Merck puts it in his pamphlet, A Safety Valve Thesis and Texan Annexation, in 1844 a nationwide debate took place in the United States on the issue of the annexation of Texas into the Union. It turned on three theses relating to slavery, each of which was sponsored by an individual well known to American history. One was the conspiracy thesis, sponsored by John Quincy Adams. Another was the safety valve thesis, sponsored by Robert J. Walker, the kingmaker of that era. And the third was the protection of slavery thesis, sponsored by John C. Calhoun. They all had their origin in the Texan War for Independence and its aftermath. Regardless, the Haitian Revolution simply exacerbated these existing fears of the Southern elites regarding abolition. So what if all of their fears actually came true? Let's assume, for the sake of the scenario, that the Haitian Revolution does indeed somehow spark a revolutionary wave in the American South, and furthermore that these revolutionaries have support from Northern abolitionists. The South, in the early 19th century, was not as impenetrable as its elites believed. Enslaved people, though denied formal education, were far from ignorant of world events. News traveled along trade routes, through sailors in port cities, and even by word of mouth among enslaved dock workers and laborers. Underground schools did exist, as evidenced by the writings of former slaves like Susie King Taylor, who wrote about her experience attending one such school, saying, "We went every day about 9 o'clock, with our books wrapped in paper to prevent the police or white persons from seeing them. We went in one at a time through the gate into the yard of the left kitchen, which was the schoolroom. She, a woman by the name of Miss Woodhouse, had 25 or 30 children whom she taught, assisted by her daughter, Mary Jane. The neighbors would see us going sometimes, but they supposed we were there learning trades, as it was the custom to give enslaved children a trade of some kind." Those that couldn't attend these group lessons, according to her, often learned through relatives out of earshot of their enslavers in the cloak of night. With this in mind, it becomes clear that the dissemination of graphic depictions of the events in Haiti would be possible, if not, perhaps inevitable. If we assume these descriptions become thoroughly disseminated throughout enslaved populations along the coastal South, who would be the most likely to receive such information, we might then also assume that some take inspiration from the readings. Perhaps the most likely location for this to occur would be in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was referred to mockingly by some at the time as the Black Republic. Firstly, there was a significant Haitian population in the city. Between 1809 and 1810, thousands of Haitians, both white, free black, and enslaved, were, as mentioned, expelled from Cuba and settled in New Orleans. The city's Creole whites around this time began to believe they needed to preserve French-speaking culture over fears of an increasing black population. They pressured U.S. officials to admit white refugees and their slaves while attempting to block the free black migrants. However, many free black Haitians, including veterans of the Haitian Revolution, entered through Barataria Bay, a pirate and smuggler stronghold run by the pirate Jean Lafitte. This migration of Haitians doubled New Orleans' population, making it one of the few U.S. cities with a black majority, being 63% at the time. The influx, however, led to a sharp reaction from the southern elites in Louisiana, who, along with the white Creoles in the city, strengthened the city's distinct three-caste racial system: white, mixed-race Creole, and black. Nonetheless, the quote-unquote Black Republic in Louisiana would end up as one of the most advanced black communities in the United States. Among the Haitian arrivals were around 200 free black veterans, including Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Savary, a former French Republican officer. And these men participated in Gulf smuggling operations and later sought to aid Latin American independence movements. In 1813, Savary offered 500 Haitian troops to support the Mexican Revolution. When that effort failed, he and his men returned to Louisiana, where they later played a role in defending New Orleans against the British in the War of 1812. We might imagine in this timeline that these soldiers are used in support of a slave revolt in the South, beginning in the epicenter of New Orleans, spreading by the smuggling ports, and captivating parts of the southern United States. Northern abolitionists, at least the more radical among them, would likely take the opportunity to support these efforts. We could see something of a reverse Underground Railroad, wherein Northerners who support this revolt could use covert methods to smuggle arms and establish contacts between insurgent leaders and their Northern sympathizers. Additionally, through traders in the Caribbean and secret emissaries arriving in Gulf ports, if this rebellion in the South organizes, which it might manage to around certain pirate or smuggler ports, Haitian leaders could easily extend logistical and ideological support to the revolutionary leaders. The real spark of chaos would come in early 1811, when leaders in Louisiana would organize a large-scale rebellion, seizing weapons from a local militia depot and attacking government buildings. White residents would flee to the countryside or barricade themselves in fortified homes, while the rebellion spreads outward. As the countryside bears witness to the flight of white Louisianans from the city, more uprisings could pop up in the Deep South. The Louisiana territorial governor would call for federal reinforcements, while white militias would also form hastily across the region. But the rebels, at this moment, have the advantage of momentum. By the end of the first week, much of New Orleans would be in their hands, and in an event that would quite clearly mirror the bloodletting of the early Haitian Revolution, captured whites, planters, officials, and prominent slave owners would be put to the sword. The greatest fears of the South would become reality. The revolutionaries, led by former Haitian generals, would declare the formation of a Republic of Louisiana, a provisional government with promises of freedom for the enslaved people who joined their cause. But unlike Haiti, where the revolution was geographically confined, this Louisiana Republic would now have to secure a border. News of the insurrection would electrify the South. On plantations in Mississippi, Alabama, and even as far as Georgia, enslaved people, emboldened by the success in Louisiana, would stage their own uprisings. While not all would be as well organized as the New Orleans Rebellion, they would force white planters into a state of permanent siege. However, the opposite would also be true, as state militias and other armed groups would number equal to, possibly greater than, the forces of these revolutionaries. Mass executions of suspected rebels in states like South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia would become commonplace, while newspapers would warn of a Black Dominion rising in the heart of Dixie. President James Madison would be forced to order the army to intervene. Madison would deploy federal troops under General Andrew Jackson, who had experience suppressing Native American resistance, and would later, at least in her own history, defend New Orleans in 1814. The U.S. Army, though small, numbering around 7,000 men in 1811, would be supplemented by the state militias from Virginia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. The federal response would also be slowed by logistical challenges in the form of poor roads and large distances in the South, and the need to balance resources between suppression of the revolt and America's ongoing tensions with Britain with the looming War of 1812. Louisiana would call for more federal support as the Black Rebel Army would grow and greatly organize under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Savary. Smugglers operating out of Barataria Bay, including allies of Jean Lafitte, could facilitate a more strengthened, continuous contact with Haitian leaders, who might now be able to send advisors and even supplies. However, again, Louisiana's flat, swampy landscape would offer fewer natural defenses, and the Mississippi River would make New Orleans vulnerable to naval blockades. By mid-1812, the rebellion would face a two-front war against federal and militia forces from the north and east, and internal divisions within the Republic of Louisiana. The provisional government, led by Savary and other Haitian veterans, would attempt to emulate Haiti's model, abolishing slavery and establishing a free black republic. However, tensions would swiftly arise between the free black Creoles, who themselves sought a multiracial society akin to St. Domingue's affranchis, and formerly enslaved rebels who would prioritize vengeance against the white planters and even certain black Creoles. This is because in the early 19th century, New Orleans, a very large number of free blacks and black Creoles, often referred to as gens de couleur libres, or free people of color, owned slaves themselves. Blacks across America did own slaves, but in New Orleans it was a much more widespread phenomenon. 28% of the free black population owned slaves in estates, often sugar plantations, and they did this for commercial purposes, just as the white and Jewish owners of slaves in the South. Part of this came from Louisiana's former owners, the French, and part from the influx of free blacks from Haiti. But regardless, this internal division between the black Creoles, the freed black slaves, and those running the Louisiana Republic would be a sticky situation that would cause a serious level of infighting that would impede the Louisiana Republic's ability to defend itself or maintain order in New Orleans. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain, beginning in June of that year, would also complicate the response, both from the black rebels and from the federal government. Britain might initially offer covert support to the Louisiana rebels, hoping to weaken the U.S. just as they had when arming the Native Americans and promising freedom to enslaved people who sided with them during the Revolutionary War. However, it is very likely that if the British were to arm the Louisiana Republic, and the Louisiana Republic and Britain were to win the War of 1812, the British would immediately turn on the free black slaves, as again, they didn't want these sorts of slave rebellions themselves. Nonetheless, initially, at least in 1812, British ships in the Gulf of Mexico could easily smuggle arms to Barataria, while the Royal Navy vessels would harass U.S. coastal defenses, with the U.S. Navy having been all but decimated by Thomas Jefferson's anti-naval policies. All of this stretching American resources very thin. However, by 1813, federal forces under Jackson would likely have the organization and capabilities to launch a successful counteroffensive to retake New Orleans. The rebels could hold out for months, especially in the bayous, but would be gradually worn down by superior numbers. The Battle of New Orleans would also become a dual conflict, with the British ships now serving to provide indirect support to the rebels. And Jackson's victory, which was historically decisive against the British, here also would serve to crush the Republic of Louisiana. The rebellion would validate Southern fears of a black dominion and of Northern abolitionist conspiracies, which could lead to things like John C. Calhoun's protection of slavery thesis to gain traction, pushing Southern states to demand stronger federal protections for slavery, including fugitive slave laws, all of which would actually give us an even worse world for African Americans, both free and enslaved, in the United States. However, we can amend our hypothetical. Let's instead ask the question, what if the Haitian Revolution spread to the American South and the Louisiana Republic succeeds, avoiding destruction at the hands of the Americans? How would this Louisiana Republic organize, and how would history be changed by it? We'll assume again that the provisional government of the Louisiana Republic is led by Joseph Savary, alongside a council likely composed of free black Creoles and formerly enslaved rebels, with perhaps one or two wealthy abolitionists or white smugglers like Jean Lafitte. The government would declare the abolition of slavery, promising freedom to all who join, and inspired by Haiti's 1801 and 1804 constitutions, the Republic of Louisiana would adopt a republican model of government with explicit racial equality. This would again disenfranchise the free black Creoles, who we mentioned earlier, who favored a multiracial hierarchy. But for the sake of the scenario, perhaps we'll assume that this outrage does not materialize significantly. We might also see the government placate some unrest among the new rebel troops in this republic, who would likely demand radical redistribution of land and retribution against the former slaveholders. The council and Savary would thus establish a bicameral legislature, following Haiti's model, consisting of a Senate elected by the council and a House of Deputies to represent the people. And the state would nationalize former plantations, redistributing land to freedmen and veterans. However, to maintain economic stability, some Creole elites would likely retain their estates, provided they free their slaves. The Republic would establish and begin to train and maintain a standing army, set up by several hundred or so Haitian veterans, who would organize those local free black militias and defecting enslaved recruits into an organized fighting force. To secure its borders, the Republic would likely begin fortifying New Orleans and different ports along the Mississippi River, but the flat terrain and river access would still leave it vulnerable to naval blockades from the Gulf Coast. Thus, alliances with the various maroon communities in the swamps could provide a defensive buffer. There is also something to be said for hired privateers. This period, while certainly not the golden age of piracy which lasted from the mid-17th century to the mid-18th century, did see a resurgence in pirate activity in the Caribbean and Gulf coasts, as Spanish naval power was weakened by revolutions in Mexico and the rest of Spanish America. We've already mentioned Jean Lafitte, who operated from Barataria Bay and Galveston Island, whose network of pirates and smugglers was one of the most notorious in the region. But it's not out of the question that the Louisiana Republic might also hire the defense of other pirate or privateer groups, whose power wouldn't truly decline until the mid-1820s, giving the Free Black Republic a ramshackle naval force. American embargoes and European sanctions would begin to hit the economy as the Southern elites realized no territory is safe from this revolutionary contagion. Now, it would be logical to assume that there would be, again, a U.S. military intervention by James Madison, but in order, for the sake of our scenario, to prevent the collapse of the Louisiana Republic, we'll assume that for whatever reason, this intervention does not occur. A non-interventionist stance from the federal government would incite sectional conflicts between the North and South, as obviously the Southerners would be petrified at a successful, widespread slave rebellion on their border, which the federal government was doing nothing about. We may see an early nullification crisis, thus, with the South seceding from the Union, organizing an army, and beginning a two-front war with the Louisiana Republic and the United States. By now, the United States would also be fighting a war with the British, the War of 1812. This war would become a much more complicated struggle than in our own history. On one side, the British will now likely align with the Southerners to fight the Americans, and the Southerners would also fight the Louisiana Republic. There is a question of whether or not the French would supply the Louisiana Republic in order to counter the British, as the French were fighting the British at this point, but I doubt they would want to supply former Haitian rebels. Savary would need to seek international legitimacy, and thus emissaries would be dispatched to Haiti and likely to Britain, but the British, this time, would probably refuse, with the South serving as a good counter against the Americans, instead of having to rely on this free black rebellion. By mid-1813, we can expect the Southern Confederacy to launch an offensive. A militia force bolstered by defecting U.S. regulars would advance on New Orleans from the east, while a second column would move through Mississippi to cut off the Republic's northern supply lines. The pivotal battles of the bayous would erupt in September 1813. Republic forces entrenched in the swamps, backed by hired guns off the coast, would ambush the Southern militia, inflicting heavy casualties. Savary's Haitian volleys might just be able to break the militia's lines. If we assume victory, this could very well inspire similar slave revolts in Mississippi and Alabama. However, the Southern Confederacy could easily regroup, now backed by Virginia's militia, and of course the British, to prepare a second, larger assault. With 1814 and the British burning of Washington, D.C. now approaching, the Louisiana Republic, but also the United States of America, would stand at crossroads. Federal troops would mass in Tennessee, preparing to fight the Southerners, while the rest of the American military was fighting the British, and the Southerners would be equally amassing an army to fight both fronts, supported by British naval operations in the Gulf, which would now pose a threat to the pirates. The Republic's economy would teeter on collapse, reliant at this point on smuggler networks and dwindling Haitian aid. Internal political divisions would threaten to fracture the coalition, as the Creole elites would plot likely to negotiate with the Americans or even the Confederacy for amnesty, while radical rebels would demand an all-out war against the South, a war which was sure to be suicide. On a foggy December morning, a British frigate would anchor off of Barataria Bay, its captain bearing a sealed letter for Savary. Rumors would quickly spread that it contained an offer of formal British alliance, contingent on the Republic declaring war on the United States. Simultaneously, a lone rider would arrive from the north, carrying urgent news. A massive slave uprising erupted in South Carolina. Savary would sound the call to convene the Council of New Orleans. With Southern armies on the horizon, he would break the letter's seal. And that's where I'll be ending this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.